Good morning, and my name is Ryan Bray, and welcome to Risk Management Professionals webinar series. Our producer, Justin Kohler, will be in the background taking questions and keeping us operational. We're using a GoToWebinar interface to support our presentation this morning. If you experience any technical difficulties, please feel free to contact our office at 877-532-0806. We have staff on the line who are more than ready to help you work out any issues that you might be having. Before we get started, the image sizes for the presenter screen and the PowerPoint presentation are adjustable. If you grab the interface point between the two boxes, you can adjust them to fit what looks best for your viewing device. We also have a dialog box for questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to send them in through the question box, and after the presentation, we'll include them in our question and answer series, or our question and answer session. Risk Management Professionals is an engineering consulting firm with core competencies including the EPA's Risk Management Plan, OSHA's Process Safety Management, and state-specific accidental release programs. In front of you is a slide about some of the services that we offer. If you have questions or need support, please feel free to contact our office. We'll be happy to answer your questions. All right, so let's get started. Today we're going to be looking at an introduction to ammonia, and more specifically, industrial refrigeration that uses anhydrous ammonia. I want to stress that this is just an introduction. There's lots of information needed in the workplace that will not be included in today's presentation, but if you're just entering the industrial refrigeration industry, this might be a good starting point for your education. All right, today we're going to cover the composition and properties of ammonia. We'll be looking at the chemical physiology and safety, some of the personal protective equipment, and some of the applicable safety standards, procedures, and training that should be included and should be known by anybody working at an ammonia refrigeration facility. So to get us started, let's take a look at a little of the history. The information that we have about ammonia is an amalgamation of hundreds of years of research. In 1774, Joseph Priestley, a chemist, first isolated ammonia vapors, and 11 years later, C.L. Bertolli identified the molecular composition of ammonia. But it wasn't until 1824 when Michael Faraday, who was looking to condense ammonia into a liquid, he was successful, realized that when he opened his test tube and the liquid ammonia began to evaporate, the environment inside the test tube was very, very cold. It was at that point that we realized that ammonia could be used for refrigeration. And it wasn't until 1908 and 1910 when Fritz Haber, a scientist, and Carl Bosch invented a way to synthesize or manufacture ammonia, and is the Haber-Bosch system that is still widely used today in ammonia manufacturing. Okay, so ammonia itself. Ammonia is a chemical compound formed by one nitrogen atom and three hydrogen atoms. We call this NH3, it's its chemical abbreviation, and this is where it gets it from. It's that one nitrogen atom and three hydrogen atoms. At atmospheric pressures and temperatures, ammonia is a colorless gas that's lighter than air and has a very distinctive pungent smell. If you've ever been around somebody who's cleaning with ammonia, you know. If it's in the air, you know, because it's very distinctive. It's very strong usually, at least in my experience. You know that it's there. Okay, just as Michael Faraday discovered, ammonia is ideal for refrigeration. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and I want to discuss those. First is those thermal dynamics, that heat, the thermal dynamics is involved in ammonia, which is what Michael Faraday discovered when he realized it was so cold. One of the things about ammonia, it has very high latent heat of vaporization. What that means is that it takes a great deal of energy for a liquid ammonia to vaporize and become a gas. In fact, it takes 1 pound of liquid ammonia to vaporize into gas completely. It takes about 1,360 kilojoules. That's a high amount of energy that it's taking from the environment in order to turn itself into a gas. And in fact, that's why it's one of the reasons why it's so good at refrigerating. It's sort of like, if you've ever grabbed a soda or a cold glass of water, and you feel it and it's cold, it's more because the cold water is leaching heat from your hand, your body heat, into itself, making itself a little warmer and you a little colder, and that's why you feel it as cold. And it's all part of that, it's all connected in that latent heat of vaporization. That's what it feels like. It's why it cools. Similar but separate, ammonia has a good heat transfer, meaning that it conducts heat pretty well it takes on the heat pretty well from the environment that's around it. Something else that makes it good from an employee standpoint is ammonia is very easy to detect. We talked about that odor. It's very pungent, very noticeable. So if you're somewhere where ammonia is contained and all of a sudden there's a release, you're going to smell it. You're going to know, and therefore you can get yourself to safety. Something else is that it's relatively inexpensive. It's one of the reasons why it's still used. Ammonia refrigeration is done worldwide. It's global. Because of that, we have a high demand, which means manufacturing can be done in large quantities, keeping the price of manufacture down, making the price of ammonia comparatively in relativity to other refrigerants inexpensive. And something else is that it has a low potential for environmental impact. In dealing with the EPA's risk management plans, we're looking at air quality, things that it can do to the environment. Ammonia is naturally occurring. Once it dissipates, it has no impact on the environment, on air quality, on the ozone. So in those instances, yes, ammonia has a very low impact on the environment. Some other important information about ammonia is that ammonia boils or vaporizes at negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit. And as it boils, it's seen as a white cloud. And I thought this was important because, as I had just told you, at atmospheric pressures and temperatures, ammonia is colorless. But as it's boiled, it's seen as a white cloud. And I have a picture there in the bottom corner. Have you ever seen a video about ammonia releases or in emergency procedures? The ammonia is shown as this white cloud, almost like a fog that expands. And that's what it looks like. Of course, as it dissipates, sort of like fog, as I had said, when it's dense and there's a lot of water droplets in the fog, you can see it. It lays low to the ground. It's visible. But as the sun evaporates it and it dissipates, the water becomes invisible again. The same thing happens with ammonia. As it's vaporizing and the density of the gas is really high, we see it as a white cloud. But as it evaporates and dissipates, it becomes invisible again. Ammonia freezes at negative 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Whoops. In between there, it is a liquid. Something else that's interesting about ammonia is that it has a volumetric ratio of 850 to 1. What I mean by that is that condensed ammonia can expand to 850 times its volume as it increases in temperature. We said liquid ammonia becomes less dense as temperatures increase, and that's one of the reasons why when we're storing liquid ammonia, we don't put more than 85% of we don't fill it more to 85% of what the container will allow, and that will allow it to expand as temperatures increase and decrease as they fluctuate, and we don't overpressurize in the storage tank. Various grades of ammonia exist. Aqueous ammonia, different grades mixed with water, different things. But for the industrial refrigeration industry, it's anhydrous ammonia, nearly pure ammonia that we're using in the industry. The standard for acceptable grades of ammonia for refrigeration can be found in the International Institute of Ammonia Refrigeration, or IAR, Standard 2. And the table below is taken from that standard, and we're looking at some of the acceptable limits for anhydrous ammonia and any additional particles. So for it to be true anhydrous ammonia, you must have at least 99.95% minimum ammonia content. So those last 0.05% can be made up of some of the following. Non-basic gas in a vapor or liquid phase. We're looking here at 25 and 10 ppm. What that means is parts per million. When we're looking at density of particulates in the air or in a gas, we express it as parts per million. So 25 parts per million or less, we can have of non-basic gas in a vapor phase, and 10 for liquid phase. Less than 33 parts per million of water, 2 parts per million of oil, and absolutely no salt, pyridine, hydrogen sulfide, or naphthalene. So when we're working with ammonia and we're working in the ammonia industry, I think it's I think it's important to start by saying that it's the responsibility of management, of operators, any part of the staff to make sure that we're operating under safe conditions. And that needs to be extended as well to the contractor support teams. Anybody coming on your site, anybody on site, whether they are a paid employee or a contractor, needs to take responsibility for making sure that we have safe operations around ammonia. That said, management is required to provide resources and working environment, or a working environment that supports safe operations. This would include any of the tools and equipment needed to do your job, and any personal protection equipment or PPE. They need to provide you with the adequate training, which would look like training on standard operating procedures, general chemical awareness. This might fall into that category. Emergency procedures, and safe work practices. They need to provide you with a facility that meets REGAGEP standards. REGAGEP is a very long acronym, and it means best practices within the industry. And management needs to provide a facility and a system that meets mechanical integrity requirements for the facility. And then they need to provide the policies and procedures to make sure that we have safe operations. This might fold back into those standard operating procedures and emergency procedures, but it can be extended to be anything that encourages the employee to have a safe working environment. Now, if you're an operator, there's a lot you need to know, and it's specific many times to your facility, so I can't get into too many details, but I've made a list of things that operators need to know, all operators. And the first thing is safe operating procedures applicable to the level of responsibility of the employee. You need to know how to safely do whatever task is yours. That's what that means. You need to understand the function and operations of each component in the refrigeration system. Evaporators, condensers, compressors, oil drains, all that stuff you need to understand. Even if you don't work on it, know the part that it plays in the overall refrigeration system. Understand how temperatures and pressures affect ammonia and its physical state throughout the system. You're going to have liquid ammonia and gaseous ammonia. You want to understand how both behave on different conditions and how it affects the body. Understand how to properly use any tools applicable to your job duty. This could be anything you need from a wrench, to any kind of monitor, things like that. And you want to add to that any personal protective equipment that you need. You also need to be familiar with the facility's emergency procedures. Your facility will either be a responding facility, meaning that they will go in and handle any release emergency management. And if that's the case, there's a whole line of training that'll go with that. If you're a responder, you'll know. But you need to be familiar, and if you're not a responding facility, it means you'll be evacuating. You need to make sure that you know the evacuation procedures and any self-rescue resources that are available to you. Again, you need to understand proper use and maintenance of your required personal protection equipment, your PPE. Even if you are not responsible for the maintenance of the PPE, it's good to know what's needed so that you can recognize if whatever PPE you've been assigned has not been maintained. You can bring it to somebody's attention and have it get the checkups or the calibrations that it needs. You want to be cognizant of the normal operating conditions of system components and look for changes in sounds, vibrations, smells, positions. This reminded me of if you've ever had a car that's, a car that you've had, but you stop at red lights and it's running and all of a sudden you hear a knocking. It's not a big knocking, but you know that it's out of order. You may get it to the mechanic and they may say, everything is in normal parameters, you're fine, but you know that it's not normal, that it's a deviation from what it's used to doing, and that there's something that needs to be taken a look at. Mechanic may not see it if they're seeing your car for the first time, but you know. So as an operator, you want to be familiar with your system. If something isn't sounding right, or doesn't smell right, or doesn't look right, or something's a little different, you want to be able to pinpoint that and bring it to the attention. If it's not your responsibility to fix it and to look at it, bring it to the attention of somebody whose responsibility it is. You also want to understand system controls and how to make control adjustments if you've been given that kind of responsibility. Okay, let's look at some safety information. Ammonia, as we mentioned before, is it's good because it has this odor. It's self-alarming. I like to say that ammonia is self-alarming and self-limiting. The sharp odor works as an alarming agent. I said that if there's ammonia in your facility or around where you're going to know for the most part. You're going to be able to detect that it's there. You're going to be able to smell it. And if it's not supposed to be there, you can get yourself to safety. So in that sense, it's self-alarming. Ammonia is also self-limiting. The odor acts as a deterrent for sure. Like I said, if you smell it and you know it's not supposed to be there, you can get out of the way. However, as we'll discuss a little later, increasing concentrations become more uncomfortable. So the general person, once it reaches a high enough concentration in the air, will become uncomfortable and voluntarily want to leave. Unless there's something else going on, most people will leave a higher concentration of ammonia. And so in that sense, it is self-limiting. Before we get into the different ways that ammonia reacts to the body and how exposure works, I want to make sure that it's clear that ammonia is a naturally occurring substance. It's in the environment, it's in our bodies. In fact, our bodies produce 50 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day of ammonia, with absolutely no ill effects to the body. It's perfectly natural. You'll find it in the soils. You'll find it in some of the foods that we eat. It has absolutely no effect. But when problems occur, when we have unnaturally high concentrations, which is what we have in a refrigeration situation, and that's where we can start to have problems. So ammonia vapors acts as an irritant to the skin, the eyes, the respiratory tract, including the mouth and throat, and of course the lungs. At higher concentration, ammonia bonds with moisture on or in the body to make a caustic substance that can result in significant injury. Below is a standard list provided by IIAR of the concentration of ammonia in parts per million and some of the physical reactions we notice as the concentration increases. At 5 to 50 parts per million, that's pretty low. It's pretty low. It's when you'll start to smell it. Some very sensitive noses have been able to smell it at 5 parts per million, but usually about 25, 35 to 50 is when the rest of us will start to notice that there's ammonia in the air. When we reach 100 to 200 parts per million, then we'll start to notice some eye irritation, very minor. And of course, if you leave, it'll go away. You'll probably, no effects, no long-term effects. But if you're in an environment with this much ammonia, you might start to feel some eye irritation. At 400 to 500 parts per million, you'll start to feel it on your skin as a burn or a rash. It'll feel uncomfortable. At 1700 parts per million, the lungs start having trouble compensating for the amount of ammonia in the air, and you'll start to see coughing in most people. At 2400 parts per million, that's when we start getting into those life-threatening situations. If you spend more than 30 minutes in an environment with more than 2400 parts per million of ammonia, then there could be some threat to life and some long-term injury. At more than 5,000 parts per million, we're at a high likelihood of death to short exposure. These are very, very hazardous environments. You do not want to enter this without the right equipment. High concentration to ammonia vapors can cause respiratory tract irritation. This can cause hoarseness, excessive salivation, sneezing, and coughing. Liquid ammonia, it's rare. It's rare to have issues with liquid ammonia. However, because it's highly corrosive to all the body tissues, it has the greatest potential for injury and can result in blistering and chemical burns on the skin. And as it evaporates and removes the heat, you can actually have freeze burns on your skin. It's very painful. I do not suggest it. Liquid ammonia ingestion is rare, but should it happen, of course, you'll see injuries to the mouth and throat, the stomach, and it can cause vomiting. If the individual who has ingested it is not vomiting, it should not be induced. 2 glasses of water should be swallowed, and that should help to dilute the ammonia until you can get it to a medical professional. If the person is vomiting, the individual should place have their face head down, their head lower than their hips, and this is so that anything leaving the body won't re-enter the lungs and cause additional problems. So this is getting into our next slide, where we're looking at some of the first aid involved with ammonia exposure. Water is the primary first aid treatment for any ammonia exposure, and that's because ammonia is water soluble. It'll help dilute the ammonia and and lessen its effect on the body. Nothing but water should be administered after ammonia exposure, except with medical supervision. Management should provide the necessary emergency eye wash stations and safety showers available. They should be readily available close near where you might have an incident so that somebody can immediately go and start flushing out any portion of the body that's been exposed to ammonia. Speaking of flushing, you should flush continuously for 15 minutes after exposure to make sure that all of it has been removed as much as possible. If you have been exposed, your clothing has been exposed, be aware that it may freeze to the body, so ripping it off could actually do additional damage to your skin. You should only remove clothing after sufficient thawing has occurred. Do not apply any creams or ointments. Again, water is all that should be used for at least 24 hours, as ointments can hinder the body's ability to dissipate the ammonia from the skin through sweat, through moisture, through anything like that. So no creams, no ointments, unless advised by a doctor. All right, so let's avoid exposure to ammonia altogether, and we'll talk about personal protective equipment. There are 4 levels of PPE that you need to know about, level A through D. And D is that minimum level of PPE, which is simply the PPE that's required for normal working conditions. And I'll get into what that might mean on the next slide. If there is ever a release of ammonia, a small one, we need to up that to level C. Anything under 300 parts per million, level C PPE is required. If it's above 300 PPE, but less than 5,000, remember 5,000 is that point where short exposure to it could result in death. If it's below that, but above 300, we want to see a level B level of PPE, and then anything above that is a level A, the highest level of PPE. Something good to note is that when going into a situation where you are unaware what the concentration of ammonia is, you always want to assume the worst case scenario, provide the ultimate amount of protection. So level A would be required if you are unsure what the concentrations are inside a hazardous environment. All right, so level D. Level D is that normal, everyday work level type PPE. We're talking about appropriate work clothing, cold weather gear for being in refrigerated areas, gloves, chemical resistant goggles, steel toe or work boots, and of course a hard hat. Very normal stuff. Level C, now remember level C is anything where we've had a release, but it's under 300 parts per million. But whenever we've had a release, you're required to at least have a full face air purifying respirator on. You want to add to that hearing protection, chemical resistant clothing, and outer gloves. Something I want to point out is that this is in addition to, for the most part, unless it supersedes what's in level D. You want to include what's in level D with level C. And this continues for the rest of the levels. If we have a larger release, remember we're between 300 parts per million and 5,000 parts per million is a level B, and it requires an SCBA, self-contained breathing apparatus. This always reminds me, if you're unfamiliar with SCBAs, it's the same acronym that's used for scuba, as in scuba gear, but that's a self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. So that helps me remember what SCBA stands for. It's that self-contained breathing apparatus. In addition to a communication system, in addition to chemical resistant clothing and having the proper foot protection and all those things and all the other levels. Level A, now remember this is where it's above 5,000 parts per million. This is the highest level. In addition to the self-contained breathing apparatus, the communication, everything else, we also want to add to that a fully encapsulated suit to protect the skin from any kind of interaction with the ammonia. So that's the highest level. All right, we're wrapping up quickly. I want to look at some of the regulations and safety standards that are out there that you should be aware of. These may not be your job to interact with the government agencies or to make sure that the facility is compliant. However, understanding the requirements outlined in some of these regulations can help you do a better job and make sure that you can identify what are safe work practices and when to throw up your hand and say, hey, this isn't compliant. This would be helpful to becoming a good operator. We're looking at 29 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 1910. 119 is OSHA's Process Safety Management Regulation. 40 CFR Part 68 is the EPA's Risk Management Plan. The International Institute of Ammonia Refrigeration, I referred to IAR several times through this series. They have a suite of standards that apply to industrial ammonia refrigeration facilities. And then I've also included in here the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, Air Conditioning Engineers, ASHRAE Standard 15. My understanding is that ASHRAE has focuses on air conditioning, not so much refrigeration, although they used to in the past. However, recent discussions from Cal OSHA regarding self-rescue have come up and they have referred back to the standard, so it's good to know that it exists. All right, in addition to that, these standards outline the training that's required. Again, we talked about general chemical awareness, we talked about safe work practices, standard operating procedures, emergency procedures. It's outlined in these what's required. It calls for making sure that we have respiratory programs, HAZWOPER training for those that are dealing with possibly emergency response. There's a lot of stuff built in these, and those are the safety standards and regulations that apply. So if you have questions about what's required, find the person at your facility who's responsible for these things, and they can answer those questions. All right, we've come to the end. Again, this was just a quick overview. Do we have any questions from the audience about any of the information that I've covered? Justin?
Not currently.
Okay, good. Good. Again, this was just a brief overview. There's lots more. Please look at those safety standards if you want more information. IAR is where I got most of the information that I provided today. They have so many things, bulletin standards, different papers on best practices for dealing with ammonia. I encourage you to go look at those, talk to your superiors, talk to the people around you, find out where they got their information. And that's going to lead you down the path to becoming a very effective, safe working operator there for your facility. Any questions? All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. If you're watching this afterwards, please feel free to email me if you have any questions. We'll be happy to help you out. Thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.